He bought the land long before anyone cared about it. At the time, it was quiet, a little rough around the edges, and mostly ignored. The road leading to it was narrow, and the small wooden bridge that crossed the shallow creek looked old but strong enough. The bridge had been there for decades. Everyone around treated it like it was just part of the land, something natural that did not need much thought. For him, it was more than that. It was the only way in and out of his property. He lived a simple life. He did not bother neighbors, did not complain, and did not ask for favors. He used his land for storage, small repairs, and sometimes just to sit and enjoy the quiet. He fixed the bridge himself when it needed work. New boards here, stronger bolts there. Nothing fancy, just enough to keep it safe. No one ever told him to stop, and no one ever said it wasn't his place to do it. Years passed, and things slowly began to change. Survey markers appeared one day near the edge of the land. Then came trucks. Then signs went up, talking about a future housing development. At first, he thought it would stay far away. The area was large, and he assumed they would build their own road. He did not worry, but the trucks kept coming. Big ones, heavy ones. They crossed the bridge daily. Each time they passed, the wood creaked a little louder. Dust settled over his land. Tire tracks cut into the ground near the creek. Still, no one asked him for permission. No one knocked on his door. They just used the bridge like it had always been theirs. He mentioned it once to a worker who had parked nearby. The man shrugged and said he was just following directions. Another time, he tried speaking to a supervisor. The supervisor barely looked at him and said everything was approved. Approved by who? He didn't know. The conversation ended quickly. He did not argue. He went home and made notes. Dates, times, how many trucks crossed, how the land looked afterward. He took photos, not in anger, but out of caution. Something felt off, and he trusted that feeling. As months went by, the land behind his property changed fast. Trees were cleared. Roads were cut into the dirt. Concrete trucks lined up early in the morning. The bridge now shook when they crossed. He repaired it again, spending his own money, because if it failed, he would be the one trapped. One evening, he noticed new signs posted near the development entrance. They spoke about safety and authorized access. None of them mentioned him or his land. Still, all traffic continued to pass through his bridge. He finally contacted the development office listed on one of the signs. The woman who answered sounded busy and uninterested. She said the bridge was part of the access route and that their legal team had cleared it. When he asked for documents, she said she would call back. She never did. That night, he walked the bridge slowly, step by step. He looked at the creek below, the water calm and low. He thought about how easily everything could change if that bridge was gone. Not just for him, but for everyone behind it. The thought stayed with him longer than he expected. A few weeks later, he left town for 2 days to handle personal matters. When he returned, something felt wrong before he even reached the creek. The air was louder. The ground looked different. And then he saw it. The bridge was gone. In its place were broken boards, tire marks, and deep cuts in the soil where heavy machines had been. The creek was exposed, with dirt pushed into its banks. There were no warning signs, no barriers, no notice left behind. Just emptiness where the bridge had been. He stood there for a long time, trying to understand what he was seeing. Without the bridge, his land was cut off. His vehicle could not cross. Emergency access was gone. Years of quiet ownership erased in one careless act. He walked closer and saw fresh tracks leading away toward the development. It was clear who had done it. They had removed the bridge like it was trash, like it had never mattered. Later that day, he drove the long way around, using an old farm route that was barely passable, just to reach his own property from another direction. It took hours. When he finally arrived, he felt tired, but more than that, he felt insulted. He called the development office again. This time, no one answered. He left a message, calm but firm. He asked who authorized the removal and when his access would be restored. No response came. The next morning, he found a short notice posted near the creek. It said the bridge was unsafe and had been removed for public safety. It did not mention his name. It did not offer a solution. It felt more like an excuse than an explanation. He could have shouted. He could have threatened legal action right away. He did neither. Instead, he went home and started looking through old files, deeds, maps, photos from years ago. He remembered a conversation from long back when a previous landowner had casually mentioned shared access, but never permanent ownership. That memory mattered now. He spent days reviewing everything carefully. He spoke to no one about it. The development continued behind his land, unaware that anything was wrong. New houses went up. People moved in. Cars crossed what used to be his bridge route using temporary dirt paths. But what they did not know was that removing the bridge had done more than block him. Out it had revealed something much bigger. As he sat at his table one evening, papers spread out before him, he realized the bridge had not just been useful. It had been critical. And the people who removed it had not asked the one person who understood that best. He leaned back, took a slow breath, and decided on one thing. He would not rush. He would let the truth speak for itself, and this was only the beginning. He woke up that morning with the sun spilling across his kitchen table, landing on the stack of papers he had been reviewing for days. The bridge was still gone, and the creek ran quietly under the open sky where the wood once held his land together. He made himself a cup of coffee and sat down, staring at the maps and photos in front of him. Each image told a story: old survey lines, property deeds, pictures of the bridge when it was new, when it had been patched and repaired. Every mark mattered now. Every scrap of information could become a piece of a larger plan. He started by walking the perimeter of his property. The dirt under his boots felt different. It was heavier, disturbed by trucks and machinery that had crossed the land while he was away. He noticed deep ruts where wheels had sunk into the soil, tearing up grass and leaving scars that might never heal. At first, he thought about repairing it, about trying to make the land look like it had before. But a small voice in his head said no. They had removed the bridge without permission. Why should he rush to fix what they had destroyed? He returned to the creek and sat on a large rock, watching the water swirl around the rocks and branches. The sound was soothing, but it reminded him of how vulnerable he had been. That bridge had been the only way in and out of his property. It had given him freedom, security, and control over his own land. Now, without it, he felt a sense of frustration, but it was mixed with clarity. He understood something he had not before. This was no longer just about a bridge. It was about respect, about boundaries, about knowing your rights and protecting them. He went back inside and pulled up documents he had collected over the years. Old emails with past neighbors, survey reports, tax documents, photographs taken at different times of the year. Slowly, a pattern began to emerge. The bridge was not just an access point for his property. It was the main route the development used to reach the homes under construction. They had assumed it was theirs to take, but legally, it was still his. This gave him leverage. More than that, it gave him a sense of power he hadn't felt in weeks. Next, he started making calls. He contacted a local surveyor he had worked with years ago. The surveyor came out the following day and walked the land with him. They measured the boundaries carefully, checked the old survey lines against current maps, and marked the exact path of the bridge that had been removed. The surveyor nodded as they walked. "They can't just take this," he said. "It's your property. This bridge was your access. Legally, they should have asked, or at the very least provided an alternative." Hearing it confirmed in person was a turning point. He had felt it all along, but now he knew for certain. They had acted recklessly, assuming he would simply back down. They had made a mistake, and he intended to make them see it. But he also knew that acting impulsively would only weaken his position. Anger alone would not bring back his bridge, nor would it protect his land. Patience, planning, and knowledge would. The following days were filled with quiet observation. He drove to the edge of his property each morning and evening, noting how trucks, delivery vans, and construction crews navigated around the missing bridge. They used temporary dirt paths, cutting across areas that weren't meant for heavy vehicles. He noticed damage accumulating, small trees snapped, erosion forming along the creek, tire marks deepening in the soft soil. It was clear they were not only trespassing, they were risking accidents. They didn't care. He started talking to residents moving into the development, carefully and without revealing too much. Some were unaware that the bridge had been his, and that the path they were using was technically crossing private property. Others assumed the construction company had handled everything legally. He listened more than he spoke, collecting their perspectives, noting the points they found confusing or concerning. This information was important. He needed to understand not just the legal side of things, but the human side too. It would help him later. One afternoon, he received an unexpected visit from one of the construction supervisors. The man was polite but firm. "We had to remove the bridge," he said. "It was unsafe, and we couldn't wait for you to respond." The explanation sounded hollow. "Unsafe?" he repeated. "It has supported heavy machinery for years. I've repaired it myself multiple times." The supervisor avoided eye contact. "The legal team said it's for everyone's safety." The words were empty. He nodded, thanked him for coming, and watched him leave. He understood now that this was not a conversation about safety, it was about control. That night, sat back at his desk and began to plan. He would need professional help, someone who understood property law and easements. He would need to document everything meticulously, every truck that crossed, every visit, every damage. It would be slow, deliberate work, but he didn't mind. If anything, the wait gave him clarity. It allowed him to study the land, to understand every angle, every weak point the developers had ignored in their rush. He spent hours reading old legal texts, property law guides, and case studies about access rights. He highlighted passages about easements, public versus private access, and responsibilities when removing or altering a shared structure. Each page made him more confident. Knowledge, he realized, could be as powerful as any physical barrier. The bridge had been removed, but that didn't mean he had lost. Not at all. Days turned into weeks. He made small repairs along his access paths, not to restore the bridge, but to ensure he could navigate the property safely if needed. He marked areas where trucks were causing erosion, took photographs, and even set up time-lapse cameras to record activity. Everything was evidence. Everything mattered. One evening, as the sun set behind the trees, he walked to the creek again. The water reflected the colors of the sky gold, orange, pink. For a moment, he allowed himself to feel calm, almost peaceful. Then he looked at the dirt paths cutting through his property, at the construction vehicles rumbling carelessly, and his resolve hardened. They had removed his bridge without permission. They had ignored his rights. That would not go unanswered. He began thinking ahead, imagining scenarios where the development would be forced to acknowledge his land and the bridge's importance. He did not yet have the full plan, but he had the pieces, and he had patience. The people responsible believed he would react in haste, that he would be intimidated or confused. They did not know him. They did not know how carefully he observed, how methodically he planned, how calmly he could wait for the perfect moment. The following morning, he revisited the surveyor. Together, they walked the paths the trucks had been using. They compared them with old maps, noting differences, overlaps, and damage. The surveyor shook his head in disbelief. "They really have no idea what they are doing," he said. "This is more than just trespassing. This is a serious oversight." Hearing this confirmed what he had suspected. He was no longer just a frustrated property owner. He had leverage, evidence, and a quiet upper hand. He returned home, organized his files, and began drafting notes for potential legal consultation. He wrote down timelines, interactions with the supervisors, photos, and observations. The process was slow, but methodical. Every piece of information could be used later, either to negotiate, correct the mistake, or force accountability. He did not rush. He knew that patience would be his greatest asset. Then one morning, he noticed something he had not expected. A group of workers had attempted to build a temporary crossing over the creek, small logs and planks hastily placed. It was unstable and unsafe. He watched from a distance, thinking about the liability. If something went wrong, who would be responsible? Certainly not the developers, who had assumed removing the bridge would be simple. He made a mental note. Every action they took without permission created more evidence of recklessness. He also noticed the residents who were now moving into the development. Some had questions about deliveries, some about mail, some about the rough dirt paths they were forced to use. Word was spreading quietly that there had been a bridge and it had been removed. He remained cautious, careful not to speak directly about legal issues, but aware that the growing dissatisfaction would strengthen his position later. By now, he had settled into a rhythm. Each day he observed, each day he recorded, each day he planned quietly. The developers assumed that the bridge removal had given them the upper hand. In reality, it had only revealed their mistake, and he was ready. Not with anger, not with rash action, but with careful observation, documentation, and an understanding of his rights. It was only a matter of time before the next step would be necessary. But for now, he remained calm, patient, observant. The bridge was gone. But the foundation for what would come next was already being built. Every truck crossing, every new path cut, every small violation of his property became a part of the story he was quietly constructing. The story of how removing one bridge would ultimately change everything for those who had acted too quickly and too carelessly. He looked out over the land one evening, the sky fading to deep purple, the creek reflecting the last light of day. He knew the bridge had been more than wood and nails. It had been the key to his land, the symbol of control over his property. Its removal had been a challenge, but it had also been an opportunity, and he intended to make the most of it, with patience, planning, and the quiet power of knowing the truth. The developers thought they had cut him off, but in reality, they had only set the stage, and he was ready for the next move. He spent the next few days in quiet focus, moving through his property with a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. The bridge was gone, but in its absence, he discovered clarity. Every step across the dirt paths, every turn along the creek, every footprint left by the construction crews told a story. They were acting recklessly, sure, but more importantly, they were assuming control over something that had never belonged to them. The thought of that made his chest tighten, but not with anger. With determination, he knew it was time to find the truth, the kind of truth that could not be ignored. He began by digging through more records. Old deeds, property surveys, tax records, and even aerial photos from the local archives. He meticulously compared lines and borders, making notes, drawing arrows, and marking key points. It became clear that the bridge was not just a path across a creek, it was the only legal access for the development. Everything else was either too steep, too wet, or belonged to other private owners. The implications were enormous. They had built homes, sold them, and allowed residents to move in, all without ensuring the basic legal right to enter the property. He consulted the surveyor again, showing the maps and measurements he had pieced together. The surveyor shook his head slowly, as if piecing together a puzzle he hadn't expected. "They have no legal access here," he said. "None at all. Everything else is blocked or private. If that bridge isn't restored, it could become a serious problem." His words settled in the man's mind like a stone hitting water. He felt the weight of it, but also the opportunity. They had overstepped in every way, and now the law was on his side. The next step was careful observation. He did not want to alert the developers that he knew the truth. That would ruin the advantage he was quietly building. Each day, he watched the temporary paths being used, noting which trucks entered, what deliveries were attempted, and the general flow of activity. He realized the development team had no idea that they were violating access rules. They were moving forward blindly, thinking they had control, when in reality, they were walking into a legal trap. He also began talking quietly with some residents. Not in an aggressive way, just casual conversations about deliveries, access, and the new homes. Many had already noticed the temporary roads and the rough conditions, but nobody knew why the bridge had been removed. He listened, took notes, and carefully avoided mentioning his discoveries. Understanding how people experienced the problem gave him insight into how to approach it later. It was not just a legal battle, it was a human one. The residents were unknowingly caught in the middle. He wanted to handle it without unnecessary conflict. Late one night, he reviewed everything again. He had old photographs showing the bridge from decades ago, a series of maps marking the property lines and modern survey data. He laid them out across the table and traced the paths. Every line pointed to the same truth. Without that bridge, the development could not legally function. The moment hit him slowly, like a rising tide. This was bigger than he had imagined. This was not just about him being blocked off. The developers had built an entire neighborhood on unstable legal ground. He spent the following week contacting legal professionals, carefully describing the situation and showing the documentation he had collected. The lawyers listened, took notes, and asked questions. They explained the concept of easements and landlocked property, terms that had always sounded abstract but now made perfect sense. "You are in a very strong position," one of them said. "They have no legal access. You can enforce your rights, and you could even require them to rebuild the bridge properly at their cost." The words filled him with a quiet satisfaction. He had not acted in anger. And yet now, the law stood firmly beside him. With the legal perspective confirmed, he moved on to a more practical assessment. He walked the creek line, inspected the temporary paths, and made detailed notes about the risks involved. Trucks were cutting corners, digging into soft soil, and creating erosion along the banks. He took photographs from multiple angles, documenting everything meticulously. Each image could serve as evidence later. A record of what happened when the bridge was removed and access was denied. One afternoon, he noticed a small delivery van stuck in the temporary path, unable to move forward without risking damage. The driver looked frustrated, and the residents waiting for the package were equally annoyed. He approached carefully, offering assistance. "The bridge used to be here," he said quietly, pointing to the creek. "It's the only safe route." The driver frowned, nodded, and backed up. No one asked questions, and he did not offer explanations. But inside, he smiled. Even small disruptions like this reinforced the point he had been building quietly. Without that bridge, everything else was impossible. He also began anticipating the developers' moves. They would likely try to pressure him, offer excuses, or even attempt to negotiate a temporary arrangement. He welcomed that. Each action they took could be documented and added to the story he was creating. He was no longer just a property owner fighting for access. He was an observer, a planner, and someone who had slowly turned a disadvantage into a quiet strength. Every morning, he walked the property line, watching how the sun hit the creek and the paths. Noting changes in the terrain caused by trucks, rain, and erosion, he started keeping a log: dates, times, vehicle types, number of trips, and damage observed. Each entry became another layer of evidence. Each day, the pattern of reckless behavior and disregard for property rights became clearer. The bridge was gone, but in its absence, the truth was visible for anyone willing to look. One evening, he revisited the idea of speaking to the residents more openly. He realized they were caught in the middle, innocent participants in a larger mistake. He drafted a simple, neutral explanation to share with them, if necessary, focusing on safety and legal issues without placing blame. He knew that public perception could play a role if the developers tried to spin the story. Being prepared, he thought, was just as important as the legal strategy. Then came the moment that tied everything together. He contacted a title company and requested historical ownership records. The response confirmed his suspicions. The bridge had always been part of his property line, and the developers had never legally secured an easement or alternative access. He had the documents in hand, official and undeniable. The bridge was his. The development relied on it. And the developers had ignored all proper procedures when they removed it. The weight of the situation settled over him. But he did not feel fear or anger. He felt clarity. He understood the power of patience, preparation, and knowledge. They had assumed that removing the bridge would isolate him, but in reality, it had revealed a much larger truth. The development could not operate legally without his cooperation. He now had leverage that could not be ignored. He began to visualize the next steps carefully. Legal action would be necessary eventually, but he would not rush. First, he would continue to observe, record, and document. Each truck, each delivery, each resident interaction became part of a larger story. Then, when the time was right, he would act decisively, not out of anger, but out of reason and principle. Late one night, he sat by the creek, the moonlight reflecting off the water. He thought about the developers, about the homes under construction, and about the residents who had unknowingly become part of a legal problem. He did not wish harm on anyone, but he understood the responsibility now resting on his shoulders. The bridge was gone, but the truth was stronger, and he was ready to use it carefully, methodically, and effectively. He made one final check of his logs and notes for the night. Each detail mattered, and nothing could be left to chance. He arranged documents in chronological order, backed up photographs, and updated maps with new measurements. Everything was ready for when the moment came to assert his rights. He felt a quiet satisfaction in the order of it all. By the end of the week, he had created a full picture. The bridge had been removed illegally. The development had no legal access. Temporary paths were unsafe. Residents were unknowingly affected, and the developers were operating under a dangerous assumption. He could see the path forward clearly now. The moment had come to wait for the right time, to ensure that when action was taken, it would be effective, undeniable, and final. The bridge was gone, but the truth had emerged in its place, and he knew that soon, very soon, that truth would demand recognition. He woke up that morning with a calm sense of purpose. For weeks, he had quietly observed, documented, and verified every detail about his property, the removed bridge, and the development that had grown up behind it. Everything he needed was ready photos, survey maps, logs, and legal documents. He knew the moment had come to act, but not out of anger. Action now required precision, patience, and careful timing. One wrong move could complicate things unnecessarily. He brewed coffee, poured it into a mug, and sat at the table. Staring at the maps spread out before him, the first step was to notify the developers formally. He drafted a letter, clear and firm, but professional. He explained that the bridge had been removed without consent, it had always been part of his property, and that the development lacked any legal access. He cited the surveyor's findings, historical property records, and the documented paths being used illegally. He didn't threaten. He didn't demand. He stated the facts calmly and requested that no further use of his land be attempted without written agreement. Once the letter was complete, he sent it through certified mail to the development office, ensuring there was proof they had received it. This was a calculated move. It was the first formal signal that the situation was serious and would not be ignored. He then made a few phone calls to legal advisors to confirm that everything was in order. They advised him to continue monitoring the property while waiting for a response, to ensure no unauthorized access occurred. For the next few days, he observed quietly. The development crews continued to use the temporary dirt paths. Trucks rumbled across soft soil, leaving deep ruts and creating erosion along the creek. Deliveries became slower and more chaotic as drivers struggled to navigate the unstable paths. Residents were confused and frustrated, unaware that they were caught in a situation that could have been avoided if the developers had acted. Responsibly, then came the moment that changed everything. One morning, a large delivery truck became stuck in the dirt path leading into the development. The driver climbed out, muttering under his breath, while a few residents came to see what had happened. He approached calmly and explained that the bridge had been removed, and that the temporary paths were not legally authorized for access. The driver's face turned pale, realizing the seriousness of the situation. The residents looked at him, confused but attentive. He simply said, "I'm not trying to cause trouble. I'm just enforcing what's legally required. This path is unsafe, and the land is private. The incident spread quickly through the development. Word reached the developers, who were not pleased. They called him repeatedly, at first politely, then with increasing frustration. Each time, he remained calm. He repeated the facts. The bridge had been removed without permission. The temporary paths were unsafe, and the development had no legal access. He refused to make exceptions, refusing to negotiate until proper agreements were in place. The developers became desperate. They sent a small crew to try and rebuild the temporary crossing. But it was unsafe and quickly blocked again by erosion and poor construction. Trucks continued to get stuck, deliveries were delayed, and complaints from residents grew louder. He observed each attempt, documenting everything with photos and notes. Every misstep became evidence. Every failure reinforced the truth he had known all along. Removing the bridge had been a mistake, and their ignorance of property law had left them vulnerable. Residents began approaching him, asking questions. Some were angry about delays. Some were worried about emergency services not being able to reach their homes. He listened carefully, offering calm explanations without assigning blame. He emphasized safety and legality, making sure they understood that the situation was not personal. By maintaining neutrality and professionalism, he gained the residents' respect. Even as frustration grew among the developers, one evening, he met with his legal advisor in person. They went over the timeline of events, reviewing the photographs, logs, and survey maps. The lawyer nodded approvingly. "You have built a solid case," he said. "They can't ignore this. And now, by restricting access, you've highlighted the seriousness of the problem. It's no longer theoretical. They cannot operate safely or legally without addressing it." The man felt a quiet satisfaction. Patience had paid off. He had not rushed, and now he had the upper hand. Over the next week, he took additional steps to formalize the restriction of access. He posted clear notices on the temporary paths and near the creek, stating that entry onto his land without permission was prohibited. He included references to property law, emphasizing that the removal of the bridge did not give anyone the right to trespass. He also informed residents, politely but firmly, that the development's current access routes were not authorized and could not be used until proper agreements were made. The reaction was immediate. Deliveries stopped, construction slowed, and complaints from residents poured into the developers' offices. The company attempted to negotiate, sending representatives to his property to request temporary access. He met them calmly, listened to their concerns, and reiterated the facts. The bridge had been his. The development lacked legal access, and temporary paths were unsafe. No shortcuts, no informal agreements. The law had to be followed. Construction crews became frustrated. Heavy machinery waited at the edge of his property, unable to enter. Trucks had to turn around repeatedly. Residents grew anxious, but he continued to communicate clearly, emphasizing safety and legality. He avoided escalation, focusing on maintaining control without unnecessary conflict. His careful documentation of each incident reinforced his position. Every stuck truck, every failed crossing, every frustrated call to the developers added weight to his case. By midweek, the situation reached a tipping point. Developers began scrambling to find alternatives, realizing they could not proceed without proper access. They sent letters, emails, and multiple phone calls offering compensation, apologies, and excuses. He remained consistent. No verbal promises, no partial solutions. Only formal documented arrangements would satisfy the legal requirements. He was firm, patient, and unwavering. Residents started to understand the gravity of the situation. Some were frustrated with delays, but most began to see that their safety and the legality of the development depended on proper procedures. Quiet conversations circulated among neighbors, and slowly, public perception began to shift. The developers were no longer in complete control. The residents, unknowingly, become allies in highlighting the seriousness of the problem. He continued to monitor activity daily, photographing trucks, recording times, and noting any attempts to bypass restrictions. Each entry reinforced the narrative he had built. Removal of the bridge without permission had consequences. and those consequences were now visible to everyone involved. He was no longer just reacting, he was guiding the situation toward resolution, using careful observation and clear communication. Then, one afternoon, a new challenge emerged. Emergency responders attempted to enter the development using the temporary paths and were blocked. The fire department had to reroute, causing delays and concern among residents. He documented the incident thoroughly, noting names, times, and any correspondence. This added another layer of urgency, as it demonstrated real-world consequences of the developer's oversight. The developers became increasingly desperate. They sent legal representatives to his property, demanding immediate access. He met them calmly, presenting all documentation, survey data, and historical records. He explained the risks and the legal implications clearly, without argument or emotion. The representatives realized quickly that their position was weak. The bridge had always been his, and the removal had been unauthorized. There was no shortcut, no informal solution, no escape from responsibility. As the days passed, the developer's frustration grew. Construction slowed to a halt, deliveries were delayed, and residents demanded explanations. He remained patient, continuing to observe, document, and enforce access restrictions. Every incident reinforced the necessity of proper legal procedure. He had not acted in anger, but in principle. The results were clear. By the end of the week, the development was effectively isolated. Trucks could not enter, construction had stopped, and residents had no legal way to access their homes beyond temporary paths that were unsafe and unauthorized. He had achieved something remarkable not through confrontation, but through preparation, observation, and calm enforcement of his rights. Late one evening, he walked along the creek, reflecting on the past weeks. The bridge had been gone, but its absence had revealed a larger truth. The developers had acted recklessly, assuming control without authority. By enforcing restrictions patiently and methodically, he had turned their mistake into a powerful demonstration of principle and law. He looked at the water, dark and reflective in the moonlight. He had not sought revenge. He had not sought conflict. He had only sought to protect his land, enforce the law, and ensure that proper procedures were followed. The situation was now clear to everyone involved. The developers could no longer ignore the reality of the property boundaries and the importance of the bridge. He returned home, organized the day's observations, updated his logs, and prepared for the next steps. The stage was set for resolution. The developers would have to act, and when they did, it would be on his terms, grounded in law, evidence, and principle. Patience had brought him to this point, and patience would guide him through the final chapters of the situation. The bridge was gone, the development was blocked, and the truth had become undeniable. And he knew that soon, very soon. The next phase would arrive, a phase where the developers would have to face the consequences of their decisions, and the residents would finally understand the full story. The morning was quiet, the creek reflecting the soft light of the sun as it rose over the trees. He stood at the edge of his property, looking at the gap where the bridge had been. For weeks he had watched, documented, and waited. The temporary paths the developers had created were now clearly visible, deeply worn, and unstable. Trucks tried to navigate them each day, slipping and scraping along the muddy dirt. Deliveries were delayed, construction was slowed, and residents were growing frustrated. The situation was tense, but he remained calm. Patience had brought him here, and patience would carry him through the final phase. Word of the blocked access had spread. Residents came to the edge of the property occasionally, curious, concerned, and a little frustrated. He spoke to them gently, explaining that the bridge had always been his, the temporary routes were unsafe, and that the developers had acted without proper authorization. Most of them listened carefully, realizing that what seemed like a small inconvenience was actually part of a much larger legal and safety issue. He did not scold anyone. He only provided clarity. People appreciated that. Meanwhile, the developers were scrambling. Their construction schedules were falling behind. Deliveries were disrupted. Equipment could not reach the site safely. They sent emails, phone calls, and even representatives to negotiate. Each request he received was handled the same way, calmly, firmly, and legally. He explained that nothing could proceed until proper agreements were in place, backed by law. No shortcuts, no informal solutions. The power of documentation and preparation had shifted the situation completely in his favor. One afternoon, a meeting was arranged with the developer's legal team. He arrived early, carrying all the records, survey maps, photographs, and logs he had painstakingly collected. The lawyers looked at him expectantly, probably expecting an emotional confrontation or an attempt to negotiate under pressure. Instead, he laid everything out calmly, showing step by step how the bridge had been his property, how its removal had been unauthorized, and how the development currently lacked any legal access. He answered every question, pointed to every document, and explained every photograph. As the meeting continued, the lawyers began to realize just how serious the situation was. Their expressions shifted from confidence to concern. The facts were undeniable. The bridge had been his, the temporary paths were illegal, and the development had been built on shaky ground. One of them asked if he would allow access while they tried to fix the situation. He shook his head. "No," he said quietly. "I cannot allow unauthorized access. The bridge was removed without permission. Any use of my land must follow proper legal channels." The developers left the meeting visibly frustrated. They had assumed he would back down, that he would allow them to continue their work while they tried to patch things up. Instead, he had calmly presented an unassailable case. Every misstep they had made was now visible, documented, and undeniable. He had not rushed, not reacted emotionally, and not made threats. He had let the truth speak for itself. And now the truth was clear.